going to this presentation, I do want to emphasize that we're a consumer organization and we believe water, at least, that we believe water is a human right and access to water is a human right. And that does inform a lot of the work we do, but we care very much about sustainability, and I will address that as well. So I will be talking a little bit about privatization trends in Chicago, but also sort of nationwide and within at the state level as well. So, just to review some basics, since it's the beginning of the day, I think most of you know this, but here are just some basic facts about water. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface, 97% is salt water, but only less than 2% is drinkable. And this is really this is really, really precious. We know that within the next 25 to 30 years, we're going to be facing globally a fresh water shortage. And so that really informs the direction we need to take our work when we think about water as a human right and having access to water. Is it something that, it really shouldn't be something that is dependent upon someone's ability to pay for water. So here in the US, I bring up this slide because we use a ton of water and we could do it we could use it in a much more sustainable way. We could invest a lot better in conservation measures. But when we talk about water privatization, we're talking about municipal tap water for the most part, as well as bottled water. But when you look at all of the water that's used every day, consumer use, like household use, really is sort of between 10 and 11% only. So when you think about where we should start with conservation, certainly it's important to conserve water within your home and at the and to take back the tap in that way, but also there's just a huge amount of water used for industry and used for agriculture, and that's really some of the biggest places we need to start in terms of conserving water. So it's just a natural water cycle. I think this should be reviewed for most of you. So, we alter the natural water cycle in a bunch of places, but really what I'm focusing on today is I'm talking about drinking water, so the water that obviously comes through the tap, and then clean water, so sewer systems. That's what we're focusing on. But when we talk about privatization and we talk about privatization and we talk about a human right to water and access to water, we often talk about how going into the next 30 years, it's very scary if corporations can control water and define who gets to access that water. So, privatization really at its core is just a company that is taking control of water in some way and defining ownership. So most people are very familiar with privatization in terms of bottled water. This is something we do a lot of work on, less so in the Chicago area. But obviously, so a company like Nestle can go in to basically any community within the United States, usually they go into water-rich communities, they'll purchase a parcel of land, and then they can pump essentially as much water as they want. They pay almost nothing for the permit, they don't pay any taxes usually. And there's really no limit on how much they can pump because there's no legislation, national legislation, that regulates groundwater within the United States. And then they turn a huge profit. There have been instances where communities run out of water, and then the irony, of course, is that they then have to buy bottled water in order to drink water, in order to really survive for those few days. And then that's very much defined by who can purchase that bottled water. There's also, we have a lot of fact sheets on fracking and electricity and agriculture, and I won't talk about those as much today, but we have a bunch of information in the front. I encourage you to peruse that. So I've already talked about bottled water, but we have our longest running campaign is called Take Back the Tap, and it essentially encourages people not to buy bottled water, not only because of the water privatization concerns in terms of access to water, but also just because there's a huge amount of oil that is necessitated in the production of plastic bottles and in the transportation of that water. We very much encourage people to really take back their tap, to drink their own tap water, to filter it if you're worried about what's in it, and to use reusable water bottles. But this is a really good entree into the topic of privatization because people are getting used to the idea of buying water from a corporation instead of getting water from a public entity. But when we talk about privatization, in Chicago, we're normally talking about the purchase, lease, or operation and maintenance contract of a drinking water or sewer facility, and by a private company. So what this really means is, there are a handful of private companies that are active both internationally and nationally that want to profit off of running our water systems. And this is problematic for a bunch of reasons. The biggest one being that when water is publicly owned, any profit that the city makes off of running that water system, the profits are then reinvested in that water system. This is incredibly important because our water infrastructure in the United States is incredibly old. It was, in most instances, installed before World War I, so it's in many places over 100 years old, and it's degrading. Oftentimes people will talk about lead pipes, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, obviously lead pipes degrading, there's a threat to environmental health, but also, we have pipes that are leaking and bursting every day. We're losing a massive amount of water because our infrastructure needs to be upgraded and maintained. But when you seek to profit off of a water system, there are two things you do right away to do that. The first one is you increase rates, rates that are skyrocketing. So within Illinois, there are some communities that have been burned by privatization. They're paying 3 times as much or four times as much as other communities that are municipally run. Like they might be paying $300, $400 a month for water. And a lot of these people can't sell their homes because rates are so high. But the other thing is that in order to profit off of a water system, you have to cut, generally, a general practice is to cut many staff who would otherwise maintain the water system. So you can't fix those leaks. You can't, you don't get people out there to replace that infrastructure when it goes bad. So we just see a huge amount of water loss, and that's obviously a huge environmental concern. But the other results of not having that staff is quality suffers. We've seen communities all over Illinois, as well as in the general United States, suffer boil warnings, which is exactly what it sounds like. Boil warnings are when you get a notice in your mail saying you have to boil your tap water before you drink it, which I don't think most people would be totally shocked by that. So that's obviously a huge concern. When your municipal water system isn't locally owned and operated, and you're looking at a company like American Water, which is a national company, the profits really leave those communities and aren't reinvested back in the water system. On average, privately run systems in Illinois, as opposed to publicly owned systems, are in violation of the Clean Water Act about 10% more of the time. And oftentimes, not only do they have a bad record with water conservation and water loss, but sometimes they have a financial incentive actually not to fix those leaks, because it's like the water meter is running and they can charge for all of the water loss, and so they can actually profit off of not fixing leaks. So when you have profits, when you have a profit motive that drives these decisions in terms of how to operate and maintain a water system, you're looking at a water system that puts profits before people, and it's a water system that isn't dedicated solely to delivering safe, clean water. So privatization, just to take a step back, within the United States is a relatively recent trend. Like we've really seen it become popular in the past 10 or 20 years. And usually we've seen these companies target smaller municipalities. At least that used to be the MO of most of these companies. But really, in the wake of the financial crisis, we've seen water companies go after bigger and bigger municipalities. So Akron, Ohio, there was a proposal to privatize the drinking water facility in Milwaukee in the summer of 2009. And the character of these proposals are really changing. Not only are they going after bigger municipalities, but instead of proposing a contract like a lease that'll run for 10 or 20 years, we're seeing it proposed 99-year leases. So you're really looking at a loss of public accountability and public oversight, not just for 10 or 20 years, but for the next 100 years. So basically a lifetime. And what most people don't realize is a lot of people have heard about privatization worldwide. Like, can I just take a poll? Has anyone heard about privatization in Bolivia and the water rights in Cochabamba? Okay, so I see a smattering of hands. So that was an instance where an international company came in, a company based outside of Bolivia came in, privatized Bolivia's water system, and essentially ended up charging people about $400 a year in a country where the average wage is $2 a day. So they couldn't afford water. There were major riots. Some people died in the riots. Incredible violence. The city of Cochabamba did take back their water system, but at an incredibly high price. And so most people have heard of these international companies outside of the US, like Suez and Veolia, which used to be Vivendi Environment, are the two biggest water companies internationally. But they're also active here. Veolia is still called Veolia, but Suez operates under the name United Water. And then the two other big players are this one company called American Water, which is Illinois American Water. Within Illinois, and then Aqua America. And Aqua America is a particularly aggressive company in terms of water shutoffs, so that if you can't pay your water bill, they will turn off your tap. And that obviously is a huge public health concern, as well as justice concerns if you can no longer access clean water because you can't afford it. And it's almost guaranteed with water privatization that some people won't be able to afford it because the rates skyrocket and it's a flat tax. So obviously disproportionately and unjustly impacts low-income communities. Which brings us to Chicago. So as some of you may know, within the past, I would say 10 years or so, our mayor has really been the nation's leader in privatizing public assets. Most recently, the parking meter system in Chicago was privatized. And I think, I've never seen Chicagoans so upset about anything in my life. But, what we saw as a result of that is people paid very, very high rates and initially very poor service in terms of actually operating that system and maintaining those meters. And we're Food and Water Watch, so we don't have a technical stance on the parking meter privatization. But we have seen a lot of problems with that deal, and to think, well, that's parking, but what if it were literally our most essential resource? What if this were our water system? What would happen then? It's a huge danger. So in the fall of 2009, there were actually many rumors that Mayor Daley wanted to privatize the water system. There was a big media blitz. But as you probably know, nothing's actually moved at the city level, which is the good news. There's been immense public outrage to the idea of privatizing our water system. Even people who believe in privatization often think this is one of the basic functions at the city level that should remain publicly owned and operated. However, there's some good news, bad news with Mayor Daley stepping down. I guess the good news would be that, the nation's leader in privatizing public assets will no longer be in office, and we will have a new city council and a new mayor. And our mayor-elect, Rahm Emanuel, has said, I think, in a radio interview that he has no plans to privatize the water system, but he has surrounded himself with pro-privatization types. And saying on the radio that you have no plans to privatize the water system isn't exactly binding. So I think this should be a good call to action because it's much, much easier to prevent water privatization than it is to deprivatize or remunicipalize your system. But I'll get to that in just a second because I now want to talk a little bit about communities in Illinois that have privatized and have been burned by privatization. So like I said, there are a lot of communities where either American Water owns their water system or they have a long-standing lease, like 10, 20 years, with American Water leasing their water system. And these communities are really suffering to the point where traditionally you think of like privatization falling along partisan lines, like Republicans are pro-privatization, Democrats maybe not so much. But that really isn't the case because there's so many Republican legislators in the Illinois General Assembly whose districts have been privatized, at least their water systems have been privatized, and their constituents can't sell their homes. So I've talked to several Republican legislators who will happily tell you that They're pro-privatization usually, but they fight water privatization. They think it's a terrible idea because it's really, really hurting their constituents, and that not just with rates, but also with poor service, with boil warnings. So there are two pieces of state legislation that directly address this. There is a bill right now that has passed the Illinois Senate and is in the House. It's called SB 0083. You don't necessarily need to know the bill number, but it's a remunicipalization bill. It's a bipartisan bill. A lot of people really support it. And what it'll essentially do, it will allow communities to get out of their contracts with American Water if their systems have been privatized. It will allow communities to buy back their water, quite literally take back the tap, and just with a simple majority of communities that are served by that water system. And it's very similar to a remunicipalization bill that was passed last year. The only thing that's a little bit different is that it allows for a majority of communities served by that water system to, if they vote to take back their water system, they can, as opposed to the previous bill in which every single municipality that was served by that water system had to vote to take it back. So previously there's been one community that holds out and then they can't. This just, I think, speaks to, this has been a multi-year process. These communities have been fighting about rates and poor service for years and years and years and years. And even with people in the legislature who are really, really supportive, it's incredibly hard to try and remunicipalize. So if possible, I always recommend trying to prevent water privatization. So I also encourage you to sign a petition in support of SB 0083. We have petitions out in the front. They look like this. I hope you sign it before you leave. And then the other thing is there was actually a state bill that would facilitate water privatization in the most aggressive way. It was written by American Water. It was in the House this legislative session, and it essentially would have allowed American Water to very easily start literally buying water systems, municipally run water systems, and then according to some criteria, set the rates at whatever level they wanted. And it would have become effective immediately, no public oversight or accountability, zero public input. So thankfully, we've defeated that bill. It's dead right now, but it will come back next year. So I think these are two really compelling issues that should encourage you to stay involved with the issue of water privatization. Like, talk to your alderman, talk to your representative, talk to your state senator, because that's the easiest way to fight water privatization is to prevent it. And on the whole, I've seen legislators be very responsive to their constituents on this. So these are just some slides about electricity and agriculture, but I'm gonna just click through them, and if you'd like to talk to me about them later, I encourage you to do so. So anyway, I just want to leave you with what you can do. One, assess your relationship to water, like how much water are you using. I encourage you to try and make a commitment to conserving at your own level of personal use. Challenge the privatization of water, stop drinking bottled water, and then take action. Take action on every issue you can, and tell your friends and family to get involved.